so what we're really doing is the following. We, uh, we furnish all these universities. Uh, International students come in. They get trained to a very large extent with taxpayers' money, even though they pay their own tuition and so on, some of them. A lot of schools are offering scholarships to international students because they need to get the research done. And so essentially what happens is we train them for 4 years. We subsidize them to a very large extent for 4 or 5 years. And then we kick them out of the country so they can go back to India and China and set up businesses that compete with US businesses. I mean, it's just nonsensical, it's just stupid, but it's politics. And so, you know, it's a challenge that the country needs to face. And now what's happening is, also applies to a very large extent with students that are coming in for business training, for MBAs. Because, you know, a lot of these students learn the best practices, what it is to start up new endeavors, new ventures, and they learn all the business skills and the business acumen and the best practices, so to speak, to do marketing and sales and product development and so on. And then same thing again, you know, they're forced to leave the country, and so they team up with the engineers that have left the country, and they're out there competing in China and India, setting up businesses that eventually compete with US businesses and European businesses and so on. So very difficult situation. You know, no end in sight in terms of the challenges that the country faces. You know, if you look at the businesses that get started in the valley, and I'm talking now about, you know, in the valley itself, where I spend a lot of my time, about 50, 60, 70% of my time. You know, if you go to, I'm sure you've heard of companies like Oracle and Juniper and so on and so forth. These are, you know, very sophisticated technology companies. You go into Juniper. Juniper was started by a gentleman that came from India. It's the largest, one of the largest networking companies in the country, now competing and giving Cisco a run for its money. And if you go into Juniper, which I do once in a while because we do some work with them, you go to the cafeteria, and most of the cafeteria is Indian food because about 50 to 60% of the employees are second generation Americans, but they come from parents that immigrated here like myself, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago and so on. The same is true of Oracle. If you go to Oracle, which is the largest software company in Silicon Valley, competes with the IBMs and the HPs and so on. And if you walk onto Oracle campus, you would think that you were actually in India, because almost every second or every, you know, 1 out of or 2 out of 3 engineers that you meet are originally from India or China, for that matter. And so, you know, our country has gotten very dependent on international students and talent that the international students bring. Now again, you know, it's not any international student. You know, these are the best of the best. You know, so there's a certain element of selection process that takes place. The top 5% of the students in India are able to immigrate, and they therefore flock to some place where they can get a higher standard of living and better wages and so on. A little bit of what I did 40 years ago when I couldn't find a good job, and so immigrated to the US. And so, you know, you've seen a lot of that, and I'm not telling you something that you don't know with respect to, you know, how a lot of these international students are coming. Now some things have changed over the last few years, especially I would say in the last 10 years, that cause people like myself and some of the senators and congressmen to worry about, and that is that with the emergence of the economies of India and China, what you're starting to see is a reverse brain drain that's starting to happen, where students that do come and get trained at our expense, taxpayers' money in the US, some of them leave because the immigration status is a problem for them, but a lot of them are electing to leave even after they've been granted green cards and have the ability to live legally in the US are leaving because they're seeing tremendous growth in China and India. And so they're headed back to their own country from where they came, where their parents live, where their kith and kin live. And they're going back because the standard of living is increasing dramatically in these countries. And that's because of the GDP growth. If you look at countries like, and again, I'm not giving you any numbers that you don't know, but if you look at countries like countries like India and China, these are countries where we have work and so we know GDP growth is 8 to 10% versus anemic 1.5 to 2% in the U.S. So these countries are growing dramatically. There's a lot of jobs being created, a lot of wealth being created in these countries, especially in the emerging middle class and obviously the upper class. And so a lot of these students are going back because they can have a better standard of living, so to speak, and be close to families and so on. And that creates challenges for the U.S. Economy in some ways because we lose talent. Now, there are things that are changing, right? So what I've told you thus far is something that you understand because you experienced that. Now, there are some things that are changing which are very interesting, and they're going to have some pretty profound implications for globalization and for international students and so on. So let me sort of shed some light on that because some of those things are going to affect you as Ministry to International Students. So let me explain what I mean by that. Because of the high rate of growth of GDP in countries like China and India, what you're finding is that the inflation is higher in these countries as well. So if you look at India and China, inflation is running anywhere from 8 to 10%. You look at inflation in the US, we're worried about deflation. And so, we're trying to make sure we don't end up in a deflationary environment. So you are looking at best a 1% inflation versus a 10% inflation in countries like China and India. All right, well, what do you do with inflation? Forget the way of controlling it, but if you are an employer, and a lot of our companies end up being employers, one of the challenges you have is you have to do cost adjustments or salary adjustments every year for your staff. I don't mean the staff that works for me, I'm talking about the companies that we fund. My job or my company does is we make investments in startups and in growth companies. We then help them grow even further, and eventually, they become public companies, and then we exit, selling our shares, and hopefully in that process, we double, triple, or quadruple our money, or our investment money. That's the business we're in. So we're running companies, or we're managing companies from a board level perspective. We don't actually manage a company on a day-to-day basis, but one of the boards of these companies after we make our investments. And so we approve the operating plans of these companies. And a common thing that we see in India and China right now is when the CEO of the company comes to us that we're on the board of saying, okay, it's time to do my annual adjustments. Inflation's running 10%, and oh, by the way, there's a lot of competition for talent. I've got to put in raises for these people. Average raises in some of these countries are 15% a year. 15%. Wage inflation in the US is 1%, right? So, when we're doing the same thing when we're doing in Silicon Valley, we're doing 2 to 3% adjustments for the employees of our companies that we've invested in the US, 2 to 3, maybe 4% best. But for equivalent companies in China and India, we're having to put in 15% raises every year because otherwise we lose those employees' talent. And we can't lose talent because otherwise how will we run our companies? All right, what does that mean? Well, if this continues for a longer period of time, what happens is that the wage arbitrage disparity that exists between the US and China and India starts to disappear rapidly. So if you look at